Alright guys, so let's talk about the frozen Russian assets. Now a lot of things happen in Davos that we must cover. The West has taken one step closer towards total confiscation. And we'll look at the discussions done and the plans being considered there. It's just a matter of time before the unthinkable happens. Russia's preparing a legal battle to fight against the seizure. They believe that asset confiscation is unlikely and will challenge the US or Europe against this. But if you look at the signs and the conversations in Davos, it's more likely than not that some type of seizure will happen. During his speech at the Davos summit, Zelensky repeated the same call for Russia's assets. He wants to seize the $300 billion for Ukraine's war effort, saying Putin loves money above all. And if you observe the situation in the West, the funds are starting to dry up fast. Yes, Germany has pledged $7 billion to Ukraine, while the UK has given $3 billion as well to fight the Russians. Now, that is a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the $60 billion from the United States, from Joe Biden. But those billions are in a deadlock. Republicans are blocking the aid until the border issue gets solved, and that could take months, maybe even a year at the very least to resolve. So there's a big urgency to fund Ukraine. The collective West is scrambling around to find a justification to use the frozen assets. It's money just sitting on the sidelines, so the temptation to just reach in is really there. And on the surface, guys, this looks like a great idea for the West. You don't need to issue more bonds and get into further debt, especially when a global recession, a global slowdown is looming. You don't want to complicate the immediate financial crisis. Now, we know the end game is extremely bad for the West. It provides a bigger reason to de-dollarize and start dumping Western assets. But it might be horrible in the short term as well. A sanctions expert says that this could bury any chance for long-term funding for Ukraine. According to Nicholas Mulder from Cornell, this move will undermine everything. If the assets are transferred, these funds too will run out sooner or later. But by that time, Western leaders would have ceased to make any political case for supporting Ukraine, and getting support back up will be much harder. In other words, this 300 billion grab might be the last tranche of money Ukraine might get. There might be no way left to raise additional funds for the war effort after this move. And if Russia manages to survive this 300 billion confiscation and outlast the West, then it's all over. Essentially, that's the big risk of this asset seizure for Ukraine. It's an all or nothing gamble, the final battle of financial attrition. Just in 2022 alone, US aid to Ukraine has eclipsed all other countries combined. America gave over $75 billion compared to just $3.3 billion to Israel. The magnitude of the funding difference is simply incredible, and it's getting harder and harder to justify more funding from debt issuance, especially when 2024 is an election year. If the Republicans don't play ball with Biden, it's likely a confiscation will happen. During the Davos summit, the West warned Ukraine that grabbing the $300 billion won't be a miracle solution, that the blowback effects could be quite severe, especially to the reputation of Western assets. The big hurdle left is to find a legal justification for the confiscation. The G7 needs to find a way to explain their actions to the world in a satisfactory way, right? And here's what Yellen said. It will be a question of understanding and seeing if mitigation could be put in place and seeing if the G7 could agree on international law rationale. And it's quite clear that the decision has already been made in their minds and the only hurdle left is a legal justification. How do we mitigate any risk against the Western financial system, right? Can we convince the world that Western assets are still safe? And there are steps already being taken to present a case that this confiscation is entirely above board. It's likely that Russia's defense will likely fail. And one argument Russia made was saying that Western governments would be in default if a confiscation happened. Because Russia can't receive the interest payments, the West has effectively defaulted on their debt. But the ratings agencies Moody's and S&P Global has backed the West, saying that there's no default risk. Countries whose sovereign bonds purchased by Russia would not be considered in default if Western governments decide to confiscate the frozen reserves. This is very big, guys. This is a watershed moment that gives the US and Europe more cover to push on ahead. If a confiscation doesn't pose a default risk on Western bonds, it allows the West to say that sanctions are the exemption to the rule. So you can see the walls closing on the frozen assets. The big question now is the mechanism of the confiscation. Right now, the majority of money is sitting in Belgium's Euroclear Bank. At least 130 billion euros are frozen there. That's assets earning interest from the bond holdings. So it's very important to listen to what Belgium has to say because a seizure can't happen without their approval. According to Alexander De Croo, the Belgian Prime Minister, the hurdle here is a mechanism for the seizure. Listen to this. We don't say no to asset confiscation, but we need to work on a mechanism. For example, they can be used as collateral for raising funds for Ukraine. Now, pay attention to the last part. Use as collateral for raising funds for Ukraine. This could be a hint that the idea of reparation bonds could be coming. And this is where Twilight Zone economics comes into play. The idea of reparation bonds is simple but crazy. It's raising money by selling debt, a special type of debt that is almost a type of derivative instrument. And here's how it works. Ukraine sells the bonds to investors. The debt will only pay out if Ukraine receives war reparations from Russia. Interest payments might simply accumulate and only be payable if Russia gives compensation. But because Russia is unlikely to pay out willingly, the frozen assets could be used as collateral. The assets might be used to pay back the bondholders, and this could mean a total confiscation of the reserves. So this could be a loophole for the West to raise additional money. We could see the US Treasury and EU governments buy these reparation bonds to help Ukraine. Because if you rope in the frozen assets, those bonds are in a sense risk-free. They're collateralized by the frozen Russian reserves. They could frame it as an asset purchase instead of issuing more national debt. And if that happens, a default by Ukraine would simply mean seizing the frozen Russian assets, activating the collateral as a payout. And obviously, this won't end well for the Western financial system, but in the short term, it's likely game over for the Russian reserves. So the unthinkable is coming. But something interesting just happened at Davos as well. Saudi Arabia is dangling a big bait to the US to bargain for ceasefire. Remember the normalization deal with Israel? Well, that won't happen until they get a ceasefire. The Saudi ambassador, Princess Rima, emphasized that the US-Israel deal won't happen until hostilities stop. The kingdom has not put normalization at the heart of its policy. It puts peace and prosperity at the heart of its policy. And this is basically a political warning to the US to stop vetoing UN peace resolutions. If you want to save relations with Saudi Arabia and not lose us completely to BRICS or China, it's time to call for ceasefire. Saudi Arabia is trying to broker peace using normalization deal as the price. And it's rather interesting that America is starting to jump on this deal. Jake Sullivan is on board with the idea of normalization. Blinken is also pushing for a two-state solution as well. The US wants to preserve their influence in the Middle East. The Saudis has made it supremely clear that formal relations with Israel is all dependent on forging a two-state solution. It can only happen through a Palestinian state. But even that is demanding the impossible because it's no longer what the US wants, but what Israel wants. Washington doesn't have control anymore. In a press conference, Netanyahu rejected America's push for a separate Palestinian state. He made a critical statement that points to bigger escalations in the region. And if you think a resolution is coming, guys, it won't be over until Israel says it's over. Netanyahu has vowed to press on until complete victory. And this means the full destruction of Hamas, which could take many months or even years. When it comes to a two-state solution, that won't happen either. Israel must have security control over all land west of the River Jordan, which would include the territory of any future Palestinian state. So Saudi Arabia is asking for the impossible. The US has also lost control of the situation, and the longer this stalemate lasts, the more likely the Middle East will explode further. Understand Saudi Arabia's big fear. They are sandwiched between a bunch of countries with Iranian proxies. There are forces in Syria and Iraq to the north and Yemen to the south. And to their left is also the Red Sea. And we know what's going on there. The naval coalition is trading missile strikes with the Houthis. Not forgetting Iran has control over the Strait of Hormuz and a big presence in the Persian Gulf as well. And if that gets taken out, Saudi Arabia's oil economy would collapse. MBS definitely doesn't want that to happen. So it's understandable why they're using the normalization deal as bait. It's all about ensuring regional security, which brings us to the chaos in the Red Sea. Over the past few weeks, we have seen massive escalations happen. The Houthis have been firing at merchant ships and the US has struck Yemen directly. So escalation risks are starting to hit new levels. Let's not forget Iran also deployed troops in Yemen and attacked an Israel base in Iraq. If this isn't a clear escalation, I don't know what is. But here's the scary thing. President Biden just made the admission that things would get progressively worse. This isn't the end yet. From Bloomberg, US presses ahead with the least bad option in confronting Houthis. Biden admits that the airstrikes won't stop the Houthis. Now, you would think there's some sort of reverse gear, at least to re-strategize and think it through, But nope, it's full steam ahead. Are they stopping the Houthis? No. Are they going to continue? Yes. And this is the official statement from President Biden. So they have sandwiched themselves in an escalation trap, an endless escalation loop. The Houthis will be firing back and the US will be forced to respond with more escalations. And let's talk about the economic impacts here, because this will impact you, me, and every other consumer on planet Earth. We are going to see a real material effect on global shipping, and it's going to cause supply side inflation to get even worse. Now, if we look at ship voyages, it's clear that the Suez Canal is being avoided. Vessels transiting the Suez have fallen by 40%, and this flow is being diverted around Africa. And this extends voyage time by at least 30%. That's on average 7 to 10 more days of voyage time and 10 more days of additional fuel being burned. And here's the thing about ships, when you extend voyage time, you also have less turnover of goods being shipped, and that's why the total number of voyages have decreased as well. So the cost of shipping has gone up, and in some cases by 200 to 300%. It's just not your stuff from Amazon that's in trouble, guys. Transporting commodities is becoming a real issue today. Drilling into the Pacifics, we can see a huge drop in oil and gas tankers transiting the El Mandeb Strait towards the Suez. Oil tankers in black has gone down by half. Gas tankers in yellow has fallen by 90%. The risk of transporting energy through the Red Sea is so great that only the brave or the crazy will dare to take the risk. And it's simply crazy. Your cargo is at risk. There could be oil spills, or if it's an LNG ship, the gas will leak out until the tanks are empty. Qatar, for example, is pausing all gas shipments through the Red Sea. These are cargo heading towards Europe, so you can already guess what that means, right? Higher energy prices for the Eurozone. Insurance rates are also climbing fast. Insurers are moving to exclude US and UK ships from any Red Sea coverage. Because of higher war risk rates, it can cost $1 million to cover a vessel worth 100 million, and that is enough to wipe out any profit margin shipping companies might get. So this could get passed down to the consumer. You can see how supply side inflation is becoming a real problem for the economy. So it's time we prepare for a world of financial chaos. There are a ton of economic Armageddon events that could change everything. If Russian assets gets confiscated, we know what's going to happen. Massive de-dollarization on a global scale will happen. We'll see an exodus of money leave Western assets and flee to places like gold. So we have to keep an eye on this, and that's why I'm still stacking more ounces, because the end game is higher inflation with a big confiscation risk coming. In the Middle East, things are getting worse. This chart alone shows us how close we are to a new inflation crisis. The number of vessels entering the Red Sea has collapsed by almost 50%. The lower it goes, minus 60%, 70%, or even 80%, costs globally will soar. And this will trigger central banks all over the world to keep higher rates for longer. And the longer this lasts, we'll see consumer confidence begin to collapse. But let me know what you think. Is it over for the frozen Russian reserves? And will the Middle East escalate even further? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.